Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Fraser, and I'm filling in this week for our usual hosts. The Ask Historian users among you may recognize me more by my handle on there, uKerpet, which you now also know how to pronounce, which is presumably a bonus for this episode. With me this week, I have Jason Steinhauer. He is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where he specializes in public history, and particularly public history in digital forms. He's also the founder of the History Club on Clubhouse, and most importantly for us today, he's the author of the recently released History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. So what we have today for you is almost a meta episode. We're talking very much about how history is done today, and particularly how it's done on social media, which is obviously near and dear to our hearts here at Ask Historians. Which I suppose gives me a nice little segue into the first thing I want to ask Jason today, which is looking through your book before this episode, I note that you don't actually mention Ask Historians in your book, and I just wanted to. Do you want to apologize to our listeners? No, sorry. No, seriously. Reddit as a platform for history. What you engage with Reddit as a platform? Was it a distinctive platform among those you engage with the book? Is there a particular kind of brand of history on Reddit that emerged in your findings?
First of all, thank you for having me here. I appreciate being here. I'm a fan of what you guys do. I would say this book is about mechanisms. And so what was interesting to me is the mechanics behind the scenes that make history visible online, why some history reaches our eyes and why other history does not. And so the case studies that are in the book are meant to illuminate for readers how some of these mechanics work in practice. At one point in an earlier version of the book, there was much more attention paid to getting more projects mentioned in the books. Historians are really keen to see their projects get cited. And I've experienced this in every part of my career, whether it be in museums or in government or in academia or on the web. It's very important to historians that their work gets cited and that their work gets celebrated. So I was sensitive to that when writing the book. And at earlier versions of the book, I had a lot more call outs to interesting projects and interesting things that are happening on the web. But the more I worked on the book, the more I realized that that's actually a different book, right? It's a different book to talk about the various projects across different platforms that are doing interesting things and the people behind those projects. And I think that would be a worthy book to write, but it's not this book. So the book at one point was about 80,000 words. In the final version, it's 50,000. So I took a lot out, and included in that was some stuff, more detail about Reddit. But what's in the book now is meant to illuminate for readers how the mechanics of the social web operate and how that affects the history that we see in front of us and the history that we never see.
Yeah, fair enough. That's actually a better answer than I expected for my somewhat unfair first question. Can you tell us a bit more about these mechanics then? Like, how do you see the mechanics of social media, the algorithms, the way they work? How do you see that affecting the kinds of history that we encounter in kind of our day-to-day digital lives?
So in this book, I give a name to this form of history on the social web, and I call it e-history. And so that's the word I'm going to use now moving forward. And in the book, on the very first page, there's actually a definition of e-history, if people want to look at that, see how I define it. And of course, these definitions can be debated, and that's part of the fun of it. But a key component of e-history is its ability to become visible, because there's really no reason to put something up on the social web unless people see it, right? If you didn't want people to see it, you would just keep it to yourself. But the fact that you're posting it means that you want it to be seen. So then the question becomes, okay, how does e-history get seen? What are the different mechanics involved in making this stuff visible online? And then how does that affect what we know about the past? And so the book then lays out a series of different mechanics, which, surprising to me in researching the book, seem to be pretty consistent across platforms and even across time and space. So for example, one of the mechanics that I talk about in chapter 3 is this notion of crowdsourcing. So information about the past can become visible to us online if it gets crowdsourced to our attention. And this is actually very germane to Reddit. It's also germane to Quora and Wikipedia and other sites that rely on this crowdsourcing mechanism in order to raise stuff to the visibility of the feed. Another chapter, talks about virality, something I call the viral past. So if something is going viral about history, you're more likely to see it than if it's not going viral. So then the question becomes, why does some information go viral and others do not? So these are the types of mechanics and mechanisms that I talk about in the book. And I think these are important for me because I think this is a media literacy and historical literacy question, right? If we can start to understand why we're seeing certain information and not others, we can start to ask better questions about it. So if you see a piece of information, you can ask yourself, okay, was this crowdsourced to my attention? Was this sent to go viral? Is that why I'm seeing it? Is it related to the news cycle? The newsworthy past is another chapter in the book. Is that why I'm seeing it? And then you can start to ask better questions about all the content we encounter.
Fair enough. What are the more controversial kind of conclusions you make in the book? Is that we should just stop sharing, that the way that we share information online is currently not fit for purpose, and the only way out of this kind of conundrum is to stop retweeting, stop sharing, whatever it is. And I guess my question from that is that how do we engage with information on the internet ethically? Because you're here trying to promote a book. You're trying to promote your own endeavors in the digital sphere. You obviously want that information to reach people. In your ideal world, how do people learn about your book? How do people learn about the History Club?
So actually, that conclusion that you cited is not in the book. That was actually in my newsletter. And so I wrote a piece in my newsletter, which I encourage people to subscribe to, jasonsteinhauer.substack.com, that posited a world where we didn't share links on social media. And actually, in that post, I specifically talked about political and news-related links because I'm less concerned about links about gardening or baking than I am about political news. And the reason is that I wrote that piece was for us to go on a little bit of a thought experiment, right? To open the Overton window a little bit wider, to think about a new digital landscape that doesn't revolve around virality, for example. Because what I found when working on the book was that the incentive to go viral on the web turns out to be a pretty bad incentive. It doesn't lead to a better understanding of the news or of politics or of history. What it does is incentivize people to try to find formulas to send information viral because regardless of how accurate it is, right? Because they know they'll get rewarded for it by the ecosystem with money or fame or attention. So what if we didn't have an ecosystem that, didn't privilege virality? What if we had different incentives in place? What if we didn't put such of a privileged status on sharing and the ability to get retweeted and reshared and to go, popular through networks in ways that gain influence and attention? And what if we shifted to other models? So I think that's a worthy thought experiment. It's fine to get pushback and it's fine for people not to agree with it. But I don't think we should be afraid to proffer such radical solutions. There was a time where we didn't share links on the internet because the internet didn't exist. And we were all able to still share information with each other in other ways. We still learned about things. We still studied history. We still kept up with the news. I'm old enough to remember those days. I'm not saying that those days were a panacea, and I'm not calling for a nostalgic return to those days, but I do think that a different world is possible, and I don't think there's any harm in imagining that world.
No, absolutely not. I'm sorry. I was not intending to put you on the spot with it, but tried to build on the thought experiment as you phrase it.
And by the way, most of the stuff that I get, like people who find out about History Club or newsletter or whatever, they actually find out about it via email. So if you notice on my social media, I don't share a lot of links online. And the only links I do share online are ones that are about me, which is very solipsistic, I know. But at least I have some sort of control over what's in the content. I don't see any, for me, this is just how I use the social web. Everybody uses it differently. For me, I don't see a lot of need to share links to the New York Times or the Washington Post, for example. They have an entire apparatus which sends content across the web. They don't need me to do their work for them. So I don't need to be a proxy for the major news organizations or for the major political parties to help them spread their message. They've got plenty of resources on their own. So when I use my social media in my little corner of the world, I just work on sharing things that I know that I've said and that I can stand behind.
I understand, part of your vision for what these kind of alternative digital spaces could look like are sort of a more decentralized version of a community-centric model where you have communities that prioritize things and incentivize things like depth, rigor, and thoughtfulness. This is, I'm speaking obviously as an AskHistorians moderator here, and that, is something fairly closely aligned with our own worldview about creating a space in which these things and this kind of content is incentivized to be created. I'm kind of curious if how do you see the internet being shaped in a way that fosters that kind of community?
Well, I think it starts with having different stakeholders at the table. So one thing I've talked a lot about is I don't like this model of engineers in Silicon Valley get together with venture capitalists, and in back rooms they develop products, and then those products get pushed out to all of us, and we just adopt them en masse. Because then by the time we realize what we've bought into, it's kind of too late, right? So I think having historians and having philosophers and having ethicists and having a diverse group of people at the table when new products are being developed is something that I've advocated for and will continue to advocate for. And I got a little taste of this with Clubhouse, a new social audio platform that I've been on, because I was an early user. So I got to have a little bit of conversation with the founders and engineers as they were designing the algorithm, building the product. Now, did they listen to me? No, not really. But at least I was in the room and at the table where ideas were being bounced back and forth. And I think we just need a lot more of that. And I think, in Silicon Valley, the venture capitalists, the LPs and the managing partners, for them, they put tens of millions of dollars into things, and then they want to see a 10x or 100x profit or return. That's the way the system works. But that needs to be balanced out with historians, with ethicists, with philosophers, with scientists, to think through these technologies and the assumptions that go into the algorithms, and to design different incentives and better incentives for the future of the web. And I think that's starting to happen in very small pockets. I think we need a lot more of it.
So if I understand your point there correctly, you're envisaging a kind of voluntary model by which big tech opens its doors to people, not just trained in computer science, but also trained in other disciplines who understand problems differently, who approach these kind of, fundamental issues differently. As you say, though, this change, if it happens, is going to be incremental. Do you think that there are things that should be done in the nearer future to try and change the way that a platform like Twitter or Reddit or Facebook operates? What kind of potential for reform do you see there?
Well, I think we as users have tremendous power, more power than we realize. I mean, these platforms aren't valuable unless there are users on them, and unless we're spending a lot of time with them. And that's one of the metrics that they all look at. It's the time spent on the platform, how many users are there, what the users are doing. So I think users have more power than perhaps we realize. And so I think if users, especially users who have lots of followers or have lots of clout in other ways, start to demand different things from these platforms, then they'll have to adjust. The challenge is that some of the business practices and business models, particularly on a platform like Twitter, for example, have now become deeply embedded within the structures of something like journalism, right? So journalism now, in some cases, it finds it hard to even imagine operating without Twitter and without links being shared and without links going viral, because that drives so much traffic to their websites and allows them to charge more for advertising. So part of this is also imagining different business models and getting different forms of support for things like journalism and history, whether it be governmental support, nonprofit support, philanthropic support, community-based support, support via crypto, which is another thing that I'm very interested in, as you probably saw in my bio. So I don't pretend to have a magic bullet that could solve all the ailments of the internet right away. But what I like to do, and I've done this throughout my career in lots of different places, is just kind of push the boundaries about what we think about and what we believe is possible. And I think that's also what historians do, to be honest, is we sort of push the boundaries of what we think we know about the past and what we think is possible to understand about the past. And, that's valuable work. It's the work that I argue for in the book.
No, fair enough. I'm very sorry to any listeners who thought we did have someone with a magic bullet for all of these problems invited onto the podcast today. Our bar was not quite so high, though. Jason may now be relieved to hear. To change, to kind of build on this idea of the role of community in making for healthier kind of digital spaces, which is one that I certainly personally agree with very vehemently. One of the problems that we've kind of grappled with a bit as a project, and I've kind of grappled with as someone who works in academia as well as, helps manage a project like Historians, is how you can productively merge kind of user-centric digital community spaces with institutional kind of heft and authority and standing. Like, how to say, sorry, I'm conscious I have an American guest that I'm talking to. How does an institution like the Library of Congress meaningfully move into a digital space in a way that isn't just, we're going to release a YouTube video once a month and we're going to call that digital engagement? What does it look like from an institutional perspective to engage with this kind of thing?
Well, I would say this. First of all, just for the listeners, I don't work at the Library of Congress anymore. I used to work there for 7 years, and that's where the genesis for this book came. But anything I say doesn't represent the Library of Congress, and actually doesn't represent the Wilson Center or anywhere else either, because I'm kind of just an independent scholar. But to your point, so first of all, I think what you're highlighting is this inherent tension between the social web and the discipline of history, which is actually the center of the book, right? The book talks about this clash of values between the professional discipline of history and the social web. And it says that e-history is sort of the way that we bridge that. It's the way that we take this expert-centric, always evolving intellectual pursuit that we call history and transpose it into the social web, which privileges the user experience and instant gratification and crowdsourcing, other sorts of things. And there are some projects that do that really well. AskHistorians is one of them. There are some projects that really struggle to do it well. So part of what I want to do in setting up the History Communication Institute, which is the thing that I've sort of been building it quietly over the past few months, is to create a space where we can have these types of conversations and we can ask why some things work and why some things don't. And we can talk through challenges and problems, and we can create, to your point, a community of practitioners who are all doing similar things across different platforms, but maybe don't always talk to each other and learn from each other and establish best practices from each other. One of the things I think about history communication that we really need in this emerging subfield is we need a set of best practices and standards. And that best practices and standards could be developed by a community of people such as yourself and others who've been doing this work and have kind of come up with some examples of what works well. And then places like the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian or the Holocaust Museum or the British Museum or whatever could learn from that, could use that as a way to model some of their own program. But, all of these institutions have a lot of inertia and bureaucracy that they have to work through. When I was at the Library of Congress, for example, it wasn't uncommon to find employees who had been there for 40 years, 45 years, 50 years, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's great if you can have that type of longevity in your career. But it does lend itself to a certain type of inertia and a certain comfort level with doing things a certain way. And then when new ideas or new approaches get introduced, there's just some, shuffling that has to happen, some changing of minds, some changing of hearts, some demonstrating in value and effectiveness. And of course, it's all happening inside an ecosystem at a place like the Library or Smithsonian that's also using tax dollars and taxpayer money to achieve its mission. So that inherently makes them somewhat risk averse and also makes this concept of authority very precious. So again, and I'm not going to give you a silver bullet for how to do this, but I think that having a community of best practices and ethics that have been developed and from people who have been doing it, and to be able to share that with people in other spaces so that they can borrow it and learn from it and see, okay, this worked and it's safe that we can go this route. I think that would help.
There are existing efforts. The National Council of Public History springs to mind, but other institutions, some of which you've been involved with, I believe, which have been dedicated to this kind of public history and these kind of questions. Do you see them as fit for purpose in a digital era? Sorry, I'm not trying to get you and put you on the spot to criticize these institutions, but what could existing institutions be doing more to do this?
Well, you're not trying to, but you're doing a good job. So. So I'll continue my diplomatic responses. I'll say this. I have been involved with the American Association for State and Local History recently. I'm the host of their new podcast series, the Reframing History podcast series. And I've been impressed with ASLH in their boldness to step into this history communication world and try to advance the field in new directions. It's not easy to do that, but they've been doing it, and they've been getting some pushback, from people in the field, which is to be expected. But of course, you also have the money. You also have to have the money to do it, right? So they wrote a grant and got a grant from the Mellon Foundation here in the U.S. to pursue this project, to issue a new report called Reframing History, to issue this podcast, which I'm the co-host of. So it's like there may be the will, but then you also have to have the way. And the way in the United States, at least, oftentimes means applying for grant funding. And if you don't get the grant funding, then you can't pay people to actually do this work. So I think the ASLH right now, because they have this grant, because they've been doing this project, and because they have some different types of people in there who are thinking about these history communication questions in a different way, I think they're well positioned to advance this conversation and to help. Other organizations may not be, just because they don't have the right people or they don't have the right resources. Places like the American Historical Association and the Organization for American Historians, these are good organizations. They do good things. They also have to be responsive to their members, right? They're ultimately member organizations first and foremost. And so they have to listen carefully to their members about what their members want. And if their members are interested more in questions around like job security and tenure and adjuncts and the way they're being abused and underpaid, or issues around diversity, education, inclusion. There's all kinds of other different issues that are pulling at these organizations, and they have to make choices about what they can focus on. So focusing on things like doing stuff on Reddit or YouTube just may not be a high enough priority for them right now in the wake of some of the other challenges that they're navigating.
Impressed as ever by your diplomacy, but I really do promise I'm going
That's what happens when you work in government for 7 years, right?
I'm going for interesting rather than controversial, I swear. One of the things I wanted to pick up on, and something I picked up on while looking into the work that you do, is this idea of history communicator or history communication. Obviously, my reference point that was science communication as a field which is longer established and has become a more kind of concrete thing in the sciences. And it always struck me that the reason that was necessary was because science has become so specialized and so technical. The amount of jargon and training you need to just understand a scientific paper has gotten well beyond the capacity of any intelligent layperson. Whereas for history, that's not quite the same thing. History, or at least it was up until a point, one of the less jargonistic of the disciplines. There have been any number of scholars who have successfully bridged that divide between writing for a public and writing for a scholarly audience. And I'm curious what you see as having changed. Like, why do historians now maybe struggle with something which they were once pretty good at?
So the history communication actually does take inspiration from science communication. I mean, when I pitched this idea back in 2014, 2015, it was directly because I had been learning about science communication and was impressed by what SciComm had put together. Now, granted, SciComm has not solved all the answers, right? There's lots of critics of science communication and lots of things science communication doesn't do well. But what I was impressed about was the infrastructure. And that's what I've been trying to build, right? I mean, there are science communication fellowships. There are science communication programs. There are science communication master's degrees. There's science communications conference. There's a science communication journal. We don't have that for history communication. But what if we did? Right? I mean, what if we had a journal where we could publish about history communication issues? What if we had fellowships for history communication where people who run Ask Historians could actually get paid for a year to run and Ask Historians by a fellowship that was funded by a foundation or funded by crypto, for example? What if we had more robust training programs for history communicators? Then, right now you might be able to get one training program a year in the United States, whether it be at the annual meeting or a webinar that the OAH put together. But what if you had trainings all year round? This is the idea behind the History Communication Institute, to start to build out this infrastructure, which I think the sciences have done pretty well and have actually managed to raise a lot of money for too, which is also can't be discounted. The other thing I think that we need in the history communication world is we need more data. Like, what actually makes an effective history communication podcast? Do we have any data to back it up? I mean, we have stories, we have anecdotes, we have downloads and listener counts, but the sciences have actually in their journals and in the field of science communication actually done some rigorous longitudinal studies about what makes for effective science communication. They've analyzed it not just through a scientific lens, but also through a communications framework, leveraging the expertise in the field of communications and media studies. I would love to see that in the field of history. I would love to see more analytical data about what makes for effective history communication on different platforms. And I'd love to be able to fund that type of research in collaboration with media scholars and with communication scholars through the History Communication Institute. So I think when we grapple with these questions, we tend to gravitate a lot towards outcomes. And that's what I think your question was about. Like, why are these outcomes less successful than other outcomes in the past? Why are we struggling in places that maybe we weren't struggling before? But I'm interested in building infrastructure. I'm interested in building an entire field that has support for people doing this work, financial support, moral support, best practices. I haven't seen that. They're starting to see a little bit of it, again, with the ASLH and some of other stuff, but I think there's so much more that we can build.
Thanks very much. No, I mean, it's an incredibly interesting thing to reflect on, because immediately when you were talking about, first you're talking about the idea of, specialist master's programs or specialist training, and then pointing out that one of the gaps in our knowledge is, the use, the availability of data, the ability to analyze that kind of data. I was just thinking, well, no wonder historians can't do this, because we are not trained in that way, which circles back to your point that we need to be, perhaps, or some people need to be.
Right. That's the other thing I've always said about this is, like, this doesn't have to be everything that every historian does, right? But there's no harm in having a subset of people who do it. And that's kind of the ones I never understood about all the criticism around this. It's like, what's the harm in having a subset of people who are interested in this and work on it? It's not to say that everyone has to do it. Like, if you're very comfortable in your academic job and you just want to research and teach and do community service or public service, like, that's great. That's an important service to the world. Do that. But there's others of us who are interested in this other thing, and we're going to build it. Fair
enough. Cannot argue with that, especially as someone who wastes an awful lot of time attempting to. And the fact I framed it as a waste of time, tongue firmly in cheek, I assure people, is indicative of that sense of value. Because one of the things that always kind of gets me about this kind of work is that it's in no way remunerated or part of a workload model or part of a tenure application. It's been almost explicitly devalued in the way that academia currently works, which I think one of those issues that really needs. For Ask Historians is a huge issue, because we need to get expertise. We need people with knowledge who are willing to contribute it, basically for free, and the people who have this knowledge are getting squeezed at both ends. And so it's a very difficult line to walk. Although I don't think we're allowed to get paid by Reddit's terms of service. Anyway. I digress.
Well, listen, I totally agree. And imagine a world where there was a History Communication Institute that had fellowship funding available, and you all could apply for funding. And because you were getting funding, you could then talk about that in your academic work as a fellowship that you received, and you could get credit for it in your tenure applications. That's the world we're trying to build. And the book and the Institute and all the stuff that I've done is hopefully building to that world.
To change chapter slightly, again, driven shamelessly by our interests as Ask Historians, I want to talk a bit about the bad faith use of the internet to talk about history, which is certainly something you deal with in the book. It's something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and I'm just curious to get your thoughts on how should we deal with the use and the creation of online spaces for history, or the abuse of history. So the example that's run to mind when thinking about this was, up until a few years ago, our Holocaust on Reddit was run by Holocaust deniers. The first place, if you put in Holocaust into Reddit search terms, the first resource you got given was Holocaust denial. And I wonder, like, what do you see as the potential for history communication or this field to combat this kind of thing? And also, where do you see kind of responsibility, like how, not just how tech companies should respond perhaps, but also kind of users of a platform like Reddit? Like, what do you see as, the way forward?
Yeah. This is, this is a really hard question, which is sort of your forte, asking hard questions. So that's good. The Holocaust is something that's near and dear to me because my grandparents were survivors. I worked at a Holocaust museum. That was my first job out of college. And some of the stuff that I see out there around the Holocaust is absolutely terrifying. And by the way, not just from Holocaust deniers, but other anti-Semitic stuff that invokes the Holocaust, anti-Israel stuff that invokes the Holocaust, stuff that comes out of the progressive and left wing of the Democratic Party sometimes that invokes the Holocaust in all kinds of problematic ways. And then obviously during the COVID lockdowns here in the United States, people have been invoking the Holocaust in all kinds of problematic ways. So there's a lot of awful rhetoric and discourse out there that takes the Holocaust and bastardizes it in all kinds of terrible ways. In some ways, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, right? And it's like you think you put out one fire and then another one shows up somewhere else. And, there certainly can be a role for historians to speak out against disinformation that is historical in nature and abuses of history and call it out. But one of the problems with that is that some of the research, and again, this is why we need history communication research, some of the research suggests that even by calling it out, you're bringing it to people's attention, right? And so even when you engage in the debate, you're actually helping to spread misinformation and disinformation, even if your role in the debate is to try to squelch it and correct it. And there's been some research around this when it comes to vaccines, but it also applies to other things. For me, I come back to giving information consumers tools that they can use to evaluate information online. And that's part of why I wrote this book, right? I want people to be able to identify what tools and mechanics people are using to bring information to your attention so that you can then begin to ask questions about it. And if you read my book and you realize, for example, in chapter 5, that there have been disinformation campaigns that have been built around historical memes. And then you read my newsletter and you read that some of those historical memes, are purposefully designed around Black history and questions about race in the United States, and that those are the starting points for disinformation campaigns that have been brought to your attention either through crowdsourcing or through virality or through visually arresting imagery. Maybe that gives you a little bit more tools in your toolkit, media literacy and historical literacy, to start asking questions about other types of content that you see. And maybe that's a toolkit that can be introduced into classrooms at grade school and at high school and at college level, where people can take case studies of these things online and start to analyze them and see, okay, how did this work? How did this Holocaust denial campaign come to dominate a particular electronic space? Was it because it leveraged virality? Was it because it leveraged crowdsourcing? Was it because it tied itself to the news in some way? Was it because it referenced XYZ number of sources? Did it pull from Wikipedia? So I just feel like for me, the contribution that maybe I can make is by sort of getting more of these tools and these skill sets into people's hands, whether it be reading the book or doing lectures or talking to students and high school teachers or whatever. And then other people can work on the debunking and the cleansing of social media spaces. One of the other problems, though, that research has pointed out, and I know this is a long-winded answer, so I'll end it here, is that there's not a lot of evidence that when you kick people off platforms for hate speech, that they suddenly just change their minds, right? What the evidence kind of points that they just go to other platforms and spread the hate speech there. So, we've gone through a process in the last couple of years, particularly on a platform like Twitter, where it, kicked off Donald Trump and kicked off other people, of sort of cleansing some of these more public spaces of some of the hateful, harmful speech that we see. But that doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it go underground. And then it pops up in other places, like on January 6th or, in future presidential campaigns. So this is another argument for why I think data and history communication research is important, because it would just give us a little bit better understanding about what actually can work and what doesn't work.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, it's obviously Holocaust denial and how to deal with it has been a very long-standing issue on Ask Historians, and we one of my colleagues, Johannes Breit, has written on it for Slate about our efforts to deplatform it. And it's an interesting question. I take your point about this idea that you're not changing minds by kicking people off, but we see it as depriving of oxygen, that we have a platform with 1.4 million subscribers at this point, those are eyeballs that do not need to see this. And if they go to another platform, it will hopefully be one with fewer eyeballs. But I do take your point that, these ideas existing underground is simply a different kind of threat, as you rightly point out with regards to January 6th.
Yeah, and just by the way, I'm not being an apologist for Holocaust deniers, and I don't think that they have if you guys want to kick them out of your space, that's perfectly fine with me. I'm okay with that.
Oh no,
I don't have any quibble with that. But unfortunately, the research suggests that it'll just show up other places, and so then how do you deal with that?
Yeah, fortunately, we don't need to moderate the entire internet, although wishing made it so sometimes. In any case, as you've rightly pointed out, I mean, I've been asking the interesting but also tough questions. I just wanted to finish on a complete softball. If our listeners are out there, probably their finger hovering over the add to basket button at their local bookstore's website, what are you going to tell them to make them click buy this book? What if you can give us the best pitch you have in the last couple of minutes?
Well, okay, I'm going to do my usual song and dance here. It's not actually important to me that you buy the book. It's important to me that you read the book. I know that times are tough. I know that people have limited resources. Not everybody can afford to buy a $30 book that's academic in nature. So you could borrow it from a friend. You could get it from your local library. You could find other ways to read it. It's important to me that you read the book. It's not important to me that you buy the book. If you want to buy it, that's great. But more important is read it. Because I think in there you will get a little bit deeper understanding about the mechanics that allow certain types of information to reach our eyes on the social web. And I think that's beneficial, not just people who are interested in history, but people who are interested in any type of information. It's interesting, people in the sciences have read this book and liked it. Marketers have read this book and liked it. And like, I'm going to use this in my marketing campaigns. So this book is really about the internet and the World Wide Web as much as it is about history. It's sort of like history is the case study for how elements of the web work in some ways. So if you're interested in social media, if you're interested in tech, if you're interested in thinking about how the web works and why we see some information on our phones and screens and why there's some information we never see, I think you'll like this book. And if you're interested in history, I think you'll also like the book. And if you do read the book, the most helpful thing would be, the most helpful two things would be, one, to leave a positive review, because the way Amazon works, it privileges books that get positive reviews, and the more positive reviews, the more it pushes it up in the newsfeed. And two, sign up for the newsletter at jasonsteinhauer.substack.com, because this book at one point was 80,000 words. Its finished version is 50,000 words. It's only 160 pages. So there's a lot of stuff that didn't make it in the book, and a lot of that is making its way into the newsletter. And the newsletter is a place for us to continue the conversation, talk about the influence that the web has on our lives, how it's changing what we know about history, how it's changing just our world in general. It's also a place where we can spotlight other voices in this area who are thinking and writing about these things. And it's a good way to stay connected. So sign up for the newsletter, read the book, leave a nice review. If you're going to be mean, not interested.
Fair enough. As a far less successful author, I can relate to the "don't be mean" bit. In any case, thank you so much to Jason for joining us today at the Ask Historians podcast. I assume we will have another podcast episode at some point, but as I mentioned, I'm the guest host and don't really know about these things. In any case, thank you very much for listening. Jason's book, History Disrupted, is now available to purchase in different places.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.